Hello, all. Today I'm going to be talking about unspeakable acts, unnatural practices. Um, this book, two reasons that I thought that it might be interesting. Number one, it's short, but two, the cover art really, really got me. So I was excited to see that, and I'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just bear with me for a minute. And I am going to show you my PowerPoint here. It will work. All right. So the PowerPoint, Unspeakable Acts, Unnatural Practices by Frank Smith. What's in a picture? So the cover art on this particular book is interesting. It's pretty old. It was drawn by P. Bruegel in 1556. The Flemish inscription is based upon the Latin proverb, "Look, son, I have long known that the big fish eat the small." And this relates to the theme of a senseless world in which the powerful instinctively and consistently prey upon the weak. So I feel like Frank Smith chose this, or his editor chose this. I feel like he probably had a role in it. But I feel like he chose this to go along with the content of the book, because the book very much talks about how the big fish are always making the decisions for the little fish. And those decisions are really only best for those big fish, where either they're lining their pockets with testing, with money, made from testing materials, or so on. It just depends. But I feel like he chose that as for a reason. So that's one reason. Another reason I chose the book, because I don't know about you all, but I always look at the book. I look at the color of the book. I look at the picture on the front. And that's just me. I may be weird, but anyway, one interesting point, I looked this up on the Metropolitan Museum of Art website, and the printer, when this was printed back in the 1500s, there was a more senior artist whose name ended up at the bottom left hand side of the picture, because they felt like it would sell more or be more popular because of the established artist. And P. Bruegel apparently wasn't established at that point. So that's another layer, I guess, that you could look at when it comes to the cover art. So now to get to the book. And I'm having a hard time seeing my PowerPoint presentation because of the stuff that's on. I don't think I can move it either. So anyway, Smith makes it clear how he feels. And I'm just going to let you look at that slide and read it for yourself. But he feels like it's unnatural, and I can look at my book and read what I put on there. But in the preface, he talks about how the sounds the phonic activities are expected to produce are literally unspeakable. And then he says their natural response to something that makes no sense to them is aversion, expecting them to behave otherwise, indeed unnatural, and them meaning the kids, the students. So this really lays the groundwork for what the book is going to be about, how he feels about phonics, how he feels about phonemic awareness, and its usefulness in the classroom. All right, let's see if it's going to let me. There we go. While reading is natural. So what I've done is I'm not going to go through every chapter, but I've picked a few chapters that I'm going to talk about. And really, the slide is there for you. And I'm going to go through these chapters and just point out a couple things that I found interesting. I really liked this book. Of course, it was short, but it presented a viewpoint that we don't often have in education. We are always told what to do and told what the best thing is to do. And there are varying viewpoints to some degree, but for him to come out and talk about phonics and phonemic awareness like he does, and that's the established standard of teaching children how to read, to me is interesting, because as a high school teacher, I did not have any of the curriculum that elementary school teachers have. I didn't learn about phonics. I didn't learn about phonemic awareness, any of that stuff. So I'm really behind the 8 ball when it comes to knowing what all this stuff is in the first place. So these classes have been a learning curve for me in the reading specialist program. And I tend to kind of lean Frank Smith's way on this because I wasn't taught with phonics. I really don't remember how I learned how to read, but it was an easy process for me. Now, for my child, it wasn't quite as easy. And this was because they taught with phonics and they used testing strategies when she was in elementary school, like Dibbles, where they had to read as fast as they could, and comprehension never came into, was never really a factor. And she wanted to know what everything meant. And so do many other kids when they're that age. So reading as fast as they can for no reason. I mean, okay, they can read fast, but what do the words mean? So by the time they get to me in high school, they can't comprehend, or comprehension is hard for them because they know how to read. They can read really fast, but what does that text say? So why reading is natural. I just broke it down into the alphabet. To me, that's amazing that we have the 26 or so letters, and they have a profound thought, a profound influence on human thought. And that's at the beginning of the book. He mentions that the alphabet was never designed to help readers. It wasn't invented or developed for that purpose. So to me, that was a big, I guess, exclamation point when I read that, because then he goes on to say the alphabet's true function has always been to help people cope with technical problems of making language visible on various contrasting surfaces to scribes, copyists, inscribers, and printers. And I never thought about it in that way. And if you do think about this, just that there are 26 letters in our alphabet, and that builds our, our language, and we can communicate with each other in print. And it is amazing. He mentions that the principal advantages of the alphabet, the reason it thrives, have nothing to do with reading. And then he brings in an analogy, and Frank Smith is really good at the analogies. They're all the way through the book, and it helps the layperson, or it helps someone taking a class, or it helps all of us to understand what he's trying to say in an easy way. He talks about an automobile. And it says, first he talks about a letterman, somebody who puts up letters on a billboard for movies. And he doesn't have to necessarily know how to read. All he does is have to follow a pattern. So just think of the economy if every automobile in the world could be constructed from a couple of dozen basic components. In contrast, the cost effectiveness of having 26 basic shapes from which to build words compared with the complexity of Chinese script. And really, I did not know that the Chinese really deal in pictures more than they do letters. But a standardized alphabetic form of Chinese became imperative with the advent of keyboards for typewriters and computers. That's kind of a sidebar. But that was interesting to me too, because you think of every language having at least an alphabet or ways to communicate, and you don't think about pictures. And I guess that's, I just didn't know that. All right, so benefits of the alphabet. This far from exhausts the utility of the alphabet. He's talking about, he goes back to how how do I write cat? We don't have to say there's an open circle at the beginning, then a closed circle with a tail, and finally, we simply say cat is written C-A-T. So he says this far from exhausts the utility of the alphabet. The 26 letters have been assigned a conventional order so that every word in the language, including names, can be put into easily sorted, easily searched sequences. Think of the utility of the alphabetical order in dictionaries, directories, libraries, and other information storage and retrieval systems. Imagine the organizational chaos if alphabetical order didn't exist. How could I construct an index for this book, he says. So the alphabet earns its keep. So he talks about the utility of the alphabet and the way in which it's used. He moves on to language. And he talks about, on page 5, we all know of the credibility of language in fiction. Of course, I recently went on a walking tour of Dublin, exploring the Martello Tower, where Stephen Daedalus lived, and eating in the pubs where Leopold Bloom died. It was only when I left that I realized that I had been following in the footsteps of totally imaginary characters, no more real than Sherlock Holmes or Doctor Who. Imaginary constructs can exist when people think they are real, not fictitious. There was a time when most of the scientific world thought that inflammable materials contained a substance named phlogiston, which caused fires, and that light waves passed through a stuff called ether, which filled up space. So this is the real versus the unreal and how we identify constructs in life. But a different point of view can be taken that learning and comprehension are simply states of the human organism. They are neither skills nor processes, but a condition of being alive. And he moves on to, on page 6, similarly, absence of comprehension is not a lack of skill, nor the shutting down of a process. It is a state to which we normally give the name of confusion. So there are two potential problems with language. It can lead us to believe that things that don't actually exist are real, and then to devise imaginary processes to describe the existence of these unreal things. So he's getting to his point about how phonics and phonemic awareness are drills and layers of nothingness almost, if that makes sense. But language is distinctly lacking in explanatory power. Whether we try to explain a person, a group, or an activity like reading, we quickly fall back on fiction and metaphor. Rather than describe the circumstances in which individuals demonstrate literacy or learn to become literate, we invent explanations. We put mechanisms and processes into their heads. Language can be used for the careful dissection and analysis of complex human behavior, but not if it is wielded like a blunt instrument. And that's on page 6. So we can move on to reading the world. And I've really started thinking about this because I have a granddaughter now. She's 2, and she sees the world. And well, seeing the world through her eyes is amazing because she sees it as it is. And that's what he points out on page 9. He talks about, I'll start my discussion of reading with a semantic point. Nothing is unnatural in the eyes of infants, and it's not. Everything they come into contact with is natural. And unnatural is a concept that doesn't exist outside language. So we're looking at language as natural and unnatural. Then he goes on to examine examples of reading. And then down at the bottom of page 10, all reading of print is interpretation, making sense of print. You don't worry about specific letters or even words when you read, any more than you care particularly about headlights and tires when you identify an automobile. So going back to that Dibbles test that I mentioned earlier that my daughter took in, I think it was probably kindergarten and first grade that she took these tests, they made them look at each letter and then each word and dissect it that way. And so no wonder kids have a hard time learning how to read. Most of our learning is unsuspected. Perhaps the most complex learning of all involves the human face. And then he goes into talking about that there are 4,000 different expressions. Also, he says when people help children to read by reading to them and with them, there is rarely confusion. So then it comes down to the haves and the have-nots almost of who can read to their child, who cannot read to their child, whether they have time to read to their child or they have the ability to read to their child. So he does get to that point eventually in the book. Moving over to page 12, the answer, let's see. So why should written language be particularly difficult, he asks. The answer is that it isn't. Reading print is no more complex than reading faces and other things in the world. He goes on to say, if phonics is an impossible system, even for computers, then any experimental study claiming to show that phonic drills have helped children to read must have been looking at something else. So he builds this in the first chapter as we're making a mountain out of a molehill almost. And he's sharing his thoughts and outlooks on it. And then he moves on to the next chapter where making a mystery out of a marvel. So the marvel, but not the mystery of reading. He talks about, we think reading is a mystery because of a problem we create for ourselves by choosing the wrong kind of model for reading. We think reading is something that has to be taught. Otherwise, it will remain a mystery to the learner. But reading is not the kind of thing we think it is or are frequently told it is. And then he goes on, it's on page 15. Reading is not like chess or golf or sailing. There is no special move to be made, no muscles to be trained, and no technical terms to be learned. So it's more of exposure and experience and what the child is exposed to and what they deem, I guess, what they absorb with what is taught or what they're exposed to. Reading is making sense of print, an everyday aspect of most people's visual world. Then he talks about, there are a couple things I've written all over this book. So I hope that I'm not going crazy or like moving, I don't know, at an erratic pace or not making sense, but I'm trying to go sequentially. And I wanted to look at a couple chapters first. Or just examine these chapters as I saw them and kind of just go over what I saw and maybe interpret what Frank Smith thinks. Reading is making sense of print, just as seeing is making sense of the visual world and hearing is making sense of sound. And this is on page 16. At the bottom, it says, to sell snake oil, there has to be a problem it will remedy. And he's comparing these phonics and all of the different phonics testing or the phonics exercises or the phonics programs that boards of educations adopt, school systems adopt, they purchase them. And so he's comparing that to snake oil, which is interesting because we do have all these quote unquote scientific discoveries, or not discoveries, but scientific information pointing to the success of phonics. And it goes back a really long time. I was talking to my parents the other day and they learned using phonics and they're 75. So I don't know what the heck they were teaching in the 1970s when I learned how to read. All right, so helping a child to become a reader requires no special materials or techniques, only vastly important and precious qualities of patience, tolerance, empathy, and sensitivity. And this is a common theme throughout this book, is that taking time with a child, taking the time to read to them, taking the time to share with them literature, but also giving them the time to make sure that they have that time to learn in their way. And because every child learns differently. Some are going to pick it up just like that. Others, it might take a little longer. But he says that there are tasks that go with this. And task 1 for the teacher to find material that will be interesting and comprehensible for each individual learner. There's nothing mysterious or problematic about that, provided the teacher's time has not been taken up with mindless activities. And this is another thing that he has throughout this book about the teacher and the teacher's importance in the classroom or with each child individually. What is interesting to me is that this was written in 2003, and not a lot has changed in education since 2003, other than the fact that No Child Left Behind, I think, was a big thing back then. And obviously we've moved away from that, but have we moved in a positive direction? Have we say we don't want to leave a child behind, but we end up leaving children behind every day, where reading is concerned. Task 2, he points, is to help the child to read. Normally the author does this if the book or comic or magazine is engrossing and easy to follow. But sometimes the teacher has to help, especially at the beginning. How does a teacher help a child? By reading for the child. First reading to the child, then reading with the child. There's no mystery here, he says, though the consequence may be something to marvel at. And the task 3 is to get out of the way and let the children get on with the reading. And that's what we do. We get in their way when they're young like this, which usually means protecting them against assessments, diagnostics, high-stake tests, interruptions, and other educational quote-unquote digressions. The only real mystery, is why all the digressions are felt to be necessary. And he uses this long couple-page analogy between Glaucon and Socrates. And on page 18, Glaucon says, there has to be an obedient and dedicated high priest in every schoolroom to inspire awe and respect in every student in the face of the mysteries. The high priest should appear to be omniscient, ready to make life-changing decisions about every child, with knowledge of every student's accomplishments and misdeeds that even the child doesn't know about. The priest ordains everything a child must and must not do in the course of a school day, and can take away the liberty of any transgressor whose offerings fail to please or who falls by the wayside. Parents must also be in awe of the power of this personage. They may complain behind the priest's back, but they must blame the child for bringing the priest's displeasure down upon the family. They may mutter if the child has to do extra duties in the evenings or at the weekends, as if they, the parents, were being deprived of liberty because of their ungrateful offspring. The whole analogy here is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but they do get to a point where Socrates is like, but supposing your plan doesn't work, would you devise some suitable punishment to keep him at his reading? And Glaucon is finally starting to see the light. Well, what a waste of time that would be. It would defeat the entire purpose of the enterprise. If I can't interest him in reading this week, I'd wait till next week or next year. There are lots of other useful things that he could learn. So giving that child the time to learn and the time to read, Frank Smith is pointing out that's the most important thing. He goes on to talk about clarifying the words, the phony words he says, like the base word phone, and phonology, phonetics, phonologists, phoneticians. Sorry, I can't say that one. But that's in chapter 3. So getting that stuff out of the way, getting it defined, he talks about that. How phonics can become an educational hazard. And this is in chapter 4. And he talks about the nature of reading, the nature of learning, the nature of teaching, especially with the nature of teaching. He says, pre-designed programs can't take the place of teachers, even when the programs are administered by teachers. So this is very interesting because he wrote this in 2003, never knowing about the pandemic. The pandemic hits in 2020, and we all of a sudden have to put these kids on a remote learning schedule, and they have to learn on their own or learn with their parents. And so it was proven, I think, that during the pandemic, teachers are important. And Frank Smith, throughout this whole book, points out that It's very important to have a teacher in the room. The teacher has to be there in order to impart the information. Since I'm running close on time, I'm going to skip over to when technology is irresistible. Actually, first, let me make a point about this slide. It was about that student who never could catch on as quickly as all the other kids. So John got left behind. And Frank Smith makes that point that we have to give these kids time. We have to let them learn in their time. But our system isn't set up that way. And how can we improve that over time? What can we do? And so he posits that question. What are we supposed to do? And we as teachers are often under the gun, so to speak, for our processes. We're only here 180 days. What can we do? We have this disruption or that disruption. So the educational system is flawed, and he does point that out. When irresistible technology meets irreplaceable teachers. So one of the things he says, I'm debating whether computers and other electronic technology in education are good or bad. The answer is it all depends. The issue is, who should be in charge of children's educational activities? A teacher on the spot who knows the children, can see them, and is sensitive to their needs and interests, or a group of experts and technicians remote in time and space who try to program children to become readers. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. We remotely had to do this. So it's interesting that he brings these things up. And he, in 2003, I think felt like technology was going to take over. And on some levels it has, but in education, I think we still need the teacher. And he points out that natural teachers are individuals with whom learners can identify. Such teachers aren't necessarily found in schools. They are the people we would like to be like, in some ways at least, and who help and encourage us to be like them. They range from the influential, if not always, to us, desirable friends that our children make in and out of school, to the formal and informal associations of people that we affiliate ourselves with throughout life. Effective teachers in schools and all other educational institutions are those who bring their students into contact with individuals with whom the students can most profitably and productively identify. And that's what we do. My research was on literature circles, and that really helped when you put kids together that could help each other. So he talks about who's privileged, and that's, just our society in general, who's going to have access to the technology, who isn't. And in 2003, access to technology was a little different than it is now. It seems like everybody is able to have technology if they need it. So a lot of things I didn't really get to talk about, but it's a really good book. I highly recommend it. It is something that every teacher should read, especially elementary teachers who have to deal with the phonics. Another point of view, there was an article in Phi Delta Kappan about decoding. Decoding obsessed curriculum with little attention to language development allows these inequities to metastasize for 4 years, resulting in the dependable disparities found in reading test scores at the end of 3rd grade. So there are achievement gaps here. And many times it's those children that are left behind where the gaps remain. And this is my graphic organizer that I chose. It came from Teachers Pay Teachers, and it's a really simple, to the point, nonfiction summary of whether it be this book or any other book. It's easy and to the point, and I've used it in my classroom. These are my references, and I am officially 30 seconds away from being out of time. So thank you very much. And if you get a chance, I highly recommend reading this book.